Hello, dear friends. Today we continue our acquaintance with the memoirs of Waffen SS Major General Kurt Meyer. Don't forget to rate the video and leave your opinion about this material. Well, let's begin. In front of us and to our right, we could see thousands of Soviet infantrymen and enemy artillery batteries rushing away along the slopes and ridges. We wedged ourselves into the stream of fleeing Russians for about 30 kilometers. Soon, it would be time for the battalion to close in on the village of Novospasovka and, perhaps, risk an assault. The masses of retreating Soviet troops would have to gather in front of this village. There, we would be able to reap the fruits of our operation. Hermann Weiser, my loyal adjutant, nodded in agreement when I informed him of my decision. A few hundred meters ahead of us was the Romanovka collective farm. The windbreak forest strip ended, and the terrain rose slightly here. Instead of a strip, a small river flowed to the south, forming a small swamp just in front of the collective farm. I couldn't see the left side of the village. I could only glance at a row of houses on the right, stretching from north to south. The village street was at least 20 meters wide. To the west of the collective farm, along the ridge of burial mounds, the Soviet troops continued to flee. I had never seen such a mass exodus before. Another 50 meters, and we reached the first houses of Romanovka. Meanwhile, the clock was approaching 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun was beating down mercilessly. A stormy atmosphere hung over the countryside and the panicked masses of people fleeing from us. Hot air shimmered between the houses on the long village street. As in other villages, there were no signs of life here. Those who had fled bypassed the village. Weiser's piercing scream hit me like a whip. Peter stopped. A shadow flashed from behind the wall to our left. I saw Weiser fire his pistol at the corner of the wall and throw a grenade at the same spot with his other hand. Damn it! I noticed a Russian anti-tank gun in a firing position and a row of Red Army soldiers lying in the corner. I jumped to the right, crossed the street in leaps, flew into a manure heap, and suddenly saw the horror in the eyes of two Russians lying by their machine gun. They had obviously just woken up. We lay opposite each other and waited to see who would make the first move. I didn't dare look at the road. A direct hit had scattered the crew of our anti-aircraft gun in all directions. The soldiers' cries turned into howls. Peter called out to me and looked for me with his eyes. He must have been behind me and slightly to the left. On the other side of the road, the clanking of tank tracks could be heard. A second shell hit our anti-aircraft gun. I had to act quickly if I wanted to leave this dunghill alive. The two Russians were still staring at me in shock. They must have thought that we had attacked the village with a large force and that their last hour had come. When I gestured for them to get out of there, they bolted like a pair of rabbits. Almost simultaneously with the two Red Army soldiers, I jumped over our broken anti-aircraft gun and pressed myself against a small slope, where I found Dreyer and Peter's messenger. Weiser had disappeared. Drescher claimed that Weiser had jumped into the house on the left. Only then did it become clear to me why we had encountered armed Russians on the way. The advance company at Inrievka had taken the wrong direction, and I immediately overtook it, finding myself in a delicate situation. I hoped the main forces of the battalion would appear soon. I was eager for SS Hauptsturmführer Fendt to appear with his anti-aircraft gun, hoping that the Russians would not counterattack. Otherwise, it would be the end of us all. I almost opened fire on Hermann Weiser. How did he manage to climb onto the roof? He kept pointing excitedly to the left. Did he want to draw our attention to the tank? We were extremely lucky that the slope protected us from a possible Russian tank. I moved a little higher up the slope until I noticed a small plane on the edge of the village. This old banger was taking off from the collective farm airfield. Maybe we had reached headquarters again? The minutes dragged on like hours. To our right, The Russians were still retreating across the mounds. We pressed ourselves closer to the ground. The tank changed position. The sound of its tracks came closer, then receded again. Suddenly, a headquarters vehicle sped out of the first collective farmyard, making such a sharp turn that it balanced on two wheels for a while. At first, we were stunned with surprise, but then we opened fire on the vehicle with all types of weapons. However, it drove away, leaving a huge cloud of dust behind. Finally, we heard the sound of engines and the clanking of tracks behind us. An anti-aircraft gun unit was approaching. Our position and the broken anti-aircraft gun for the Grenadiers were sufficient guidance for action. With a deft turn, the driver turned the tractor so that the gun was immediately in firing position. A few seconds later, shrapnel shells exploded along the road. SS Hauptsturmführer Fendt tried to destroy the plane on the airfield, but it was not as easy to do as it seemed. The staff car drove up to the plane, and soon it took off like a tired bird. The plane made a large circle over the collective farm and disappeared over the horizon. Our anti-aircraft gun worked wonders. Our fighting spirit returned, and the paralysis of the last half hour passed. How wonderful it was that its shells whistled past us. What pleasant music for soldiers who had already counted themselves among the dead and buried. However, a heavy Russian tank broke through the orchards behind us. We couldn't fire at it because the slope blocked our view. Infantry guns were brought to the firing position, an anti-tank gun approached, and together with the anti-aircraft gun, it opened fire on the retreating enemy columns. Finally, I had a platoon of sappers at my disposal. With their help, I was able to advance further into the village. I wanted to know what was going on there. We entered the first house without a fight. An excited Weiser approached and led the team of sappers to the entrance to the cellar. To my amazement, I saw Soviet commanders climbing out of the dark cellar. Weiser led me to the building and reported, "Suddenly, to our left, I noticed a Russian tank." Its crew was having breakfast. Before I even had a chance to let you know about my discovery, an anti-tank gun was pointed at us. I didn't know what to do. Jumping up, I opened fire on the crew and threw a grenade at them. I didn't know what had happened to the Russians. I just wanted to get away to some safe place as quickly as possible. I threw open the door of the house and found myself face to face with several high-ranking Soviet commanders who were discussing the situation, huddled around a map spread out on the table. My appearance had a stunning effect. The Red commanders began jumping headfirst out the window. Terrified, I jumped up the stairs to the attic and saw you behind a manure pile. On the opposite side of the house, many Soviet soldiers and officers were fleeing. Several senior officers climbed onto a tank and drove away. We had definitely captured the command headquarters. Before examining the trophies, I gave a dressing down to the commander of the 2nd Company of the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion, who had appeared by then. His guilty expression saved him from a thorough scolding, and he eagerly set about carrying out his new orders. Weiser's joyful exclamation prompted me to enter the house. Peter had already put on the Russian general's shirt. There were numerous maps on the table and a radio station in the next room. We had broken into the headquarters of the 9th Russian Army, but unfortunately, the commander had fled by plane with the Air Force general, and before that, in a staff car, which we had fired upon. Among the prisoners were several staff officers and the secretary of the Air Force general. They all behaved correctly and with dignity, and only during interrogation did we learn that the headquarters of the Russian 30th Rifle Division had been captured earlier at a collective farm. The 9th Army was retreating in panic toward Rostov. Proud of such an extraordinary success, I sent a report to the division and was thunderstruck when the radio operator relayed the division's response. "What is all this boasting?" A bucket of ice water would not have had such a stunning effect. After calming down a bit, I sent the captured staff officer and secretary to the division. Soon, my radio operators began transmitting orders in Russian. We wanted to deceive the retreating Russians and force them to go on the defensive, thereby giving Mackensen's motorized corps the opportunity to close the lid on the cauldron. But the Soviet troops could not be stopped. Their disorderly retreat continued. Bremer's company requested support. During the pursuit, it became involved in fighting. We had to wait for the next day's offensive and the infantry following behind us. For the first time, we were unable to make an inventory of the trophies. All around us were abandoned guns, tractors, and horse-drawn carts. Numerous prisoners marched westward, and many Russians were killed. We lost 3 men killed, 27 wounded, and 1 soldier missing. Just before nightfall, Witt's battalion arrived and completed the search of the village. Bremer returned to the battalion at midnight. With the 1st Battalion of the 1st SS Motorized Infantry Regiment, which was in our rear guard, we continued the offensive on October 7th with orders to take the port city of Berdyansk. We passed the outposts in the cold autumn fog. The 1st Company of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion was in front. We encountered damaged and abandoned Russian guns, armored vehicles, and tanks. In Berdyansk, we encountered insignificant enemy forces which were retreating as quickly as they could to the east. On the main street of Berdyansk, we found many shot Russian civilians. Some victims with severe bullet wounds crawled toward us, begging for help. Unfortunately, I never found out why Soviet troops had massacred civilians. The collective farm in Androvka was taken after a short but intense battle, and we continued our pursuit at full speed. Strong enemy artillery columns retreated across the low hills in front of us and to our right. We caught up with them and captured them so quickly that the Soviet artillerymen did not even have time to bring their guns into combat position. By 10 o'clock in the morning, we could no longer count our prisoners and trophies. The day was an exact replica of the previous one, and we were unable to increase our pace. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. See you all soon.